There is, of course, the chaos in terms of information that can be produced. There are, of course, security issues. And by the way, this agentic chaos we talked about, the CIO had to make an executive decision saying that no more agents. Every time you now create an agent, you need to get it approved through my office before you kind of you post it or register it on
Okay.
the MCP server.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be we're not able to keep track of what's actually happening.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast. Joining my co-host Michael Watson and I today is Dr. Ram Bala, who wears a lot of different hats. He's got the same hairstyle that I do, so we need hats. He's a professor at Santa Clara University in the School of Business. He's the co-author of a new book called The AI-Centered Enterprise, and he's the co-founder of a company called Samvid.ai that we're going to talk about a little bit today. Welcome, Ram, and I'll throw it over to Mike to get us started.
All right. Yeah, welcome, Ram. So the first question is, let's just start right off with, you've defined a term, contextual AI. Like, how do you define that, and why do we need such a term?
First of all, thank you, Vijay and Michael, for inviting me on the Decision Intelligence podcast. It's wonderful to be here and talk about some of these issues. So we all, if you talk to the common person on the street and ask them what AI is, the first thing that will come to mind is maybe ChatGPT, these days Clara. And when they go in there and most people, you'll notice, are going to go in there and ask a question without any further information. I want to know something about a particular topic, and they're going to get a response back. That is fundamentally not anchored to any sort of specific context that they are in. And by context, I want to drill this down a little more.
Yeah.
I'm talking about not just the any content that they might upload, which is relevant to them, but also the intent with which they are trying to attack the problem. Now, sometimes they might give some clues saying that, hey, this is kind of the kind of problem I'm trying to solve. But to truly answer a question and do many other things, we'll talk about that as well. You need to know not just what data you have, but also what are you trying to achieve? This notion of objectives, right? So what is it that the user is actually trying to achieve? And having that in place makes the use of AI much more effective. And when I say AI, I'm talking about, let's say, large language models, for instance.
Right. Okay.
Right. And really, it unlocks many different capabilities, many different directions you can go in, and many different problems that you can actually solve beyond the ordinary.
Yeah. So the idea here is that if I just ask a generic question like, how do I solve a facility location problem? It gives me a nice generic answer. But what you're suggesting was contextual. Is I need to put some framework around it to say, like, is service more important than cost? Is, what kind of business am I in? Is it easy to transport product? What's the difference between inbound and outbound? And then get a more nuanced answer. Is that sort of the
Absolutely.
gist of it?
Absolutely. There are a couple of different levels to this. One is, of course, giving more details about exactly the kind of problem you're trying to solve. And that, oftentimes you want to ensure that, particularly in an enterprise context, right? What the users don't want to go in and give all the details every time. You want to be able to sort of understand. So, I might just say a couple of things, but then I know exactly, what this user is in the context of this organization, what kind of data they have access to, and so that then provides the context to be able to answer the question even beyond what the two lines that they may have actually input, because at that point we're talking about something that's very, very specific to the user. Now, one level is just the data that they have access to and sort of giving more details about the specific problem, but also you could go beyond that and think about things like, what is their functional role in the organization? I mean, what kind of incentives do they actually have? For example, I give this very common example of sort of a transaction that happens in most organizations. You have a procurement person who's trying to get the best deal for the company, and you have a legal person whose entire role is, if a contract comes in, I'm going to evaluate this contract for all kinds of different risks. Now,
Right.
these are two very different perspectives, and on the same document, right? And so that's capturing that perspective, those incentives. That is something that what contextual AI is really a big part of contextual AI is really that, right? So to not just understand the data landscape, but also the specific roles and functions that individuals occupy.
That's awesome. So the idea is like if I'm implementing this as a company and a leader in a company, what I want to make sure when it gets implemented that when someone in the legal department is asking a question, that risk is always in the background, and when someone in purchasing, maybe something else is price
Right.
is always in the background.
And
Like
they don't have
it's
to go in and say this every time. So in a
right.
sense, it's, if it's the legal person, they don't have to go in and say, "Hey, I am the legal person," and these are the things I'm looking for. These are things that should be naturally, be part of the context and should be, an integral part of giving them the answer, right? So that's part of it. Yeah. There's one more level to it that we can unpack here as well, which is not only talking about these two individuals, and if you go to the book, our big central theme was exactly this, right? So when I'm talking about context-aware AI at the level of the individual, whether it's a legal person or the procurement person, we are still talking about improving individual productivity, sort of ensuring that each of these individuals actually becomes more productive in what they're doing. But you could take that to the next level and say, hey, one of the biggest problems organizations have is that when the actual deal has to be executed, the procurement person and the legal person do not align, right? So they've used AI to kind of make themselves more productive, but then they're having these constant stream of emails and in-person meetings, Zoom calls to figure out what the misalignment between them is, right? And often, if they say, for example, this gets particularly bad if either or both people do not have much history with the organization and they are relatively new, for example. And so I actually believe that understanding context at an individual role level is, and we're actually now building these systems as well. Understanding context at the individual role level can be expanded to think about communication across these roles and how AI can actually moderate those communications and actually make that communication a lot better. So we are not only talking about making them more productive, but also aligning their incentives, aligning their sort of goals so that the organization can actually benefit.
Wow, that alignment question is such a big one. When we think about it now, kind of stepping back, how do we, uh, how do our frontline employees use context today? And oh, how much of that is captured in systems versus just stuck in their head? And how do we draw that out?
So that's a great question, Vijay. So I think that you're absolutely right about the fact that much of context today that is either stuck in people's heads or it's in documents that no one has read. So, right. So which means that we have a dual problem. So the first step is, I think we are beginning to attack that problem now. There is context that's buried in unstructured data, whether these are minutes of meetings, for instance, right? Or of course the contracts, past invoices, other kinds of email conversations, or whatever it might be, right? And those are things that are documented, but no one has looked at them, but they provide important context. I think with the AI we have today, we have the ability to be able to at least start moving in that direction. Although I think even that is an incredibly hard problem because you have to resolve all these issues about who gets access to what data. Should we be able to read emails or not? Should what there's a ton of problems to solve. I mean, I don't think even that is going to be is going to be an ongoing effort. It's going to take a lot of effort to solve. But then there is this second level that they're talking about, which is the data that's not even documented. And that's going to be the more challenging part because we first have to find a way to actually document it. I still think it's become a little easier because today somebody could just write up some handwritten notes and we now have the tools to be able to not only to parse that and be able to convert that into meaningful information and connect the dots across different other parts of the organization. But still that effort has to be taken. That's a change management exercise to be able to document that. And this is such an important problem. I was talking to this manufacturing company in upstate New York, and they said that there is I said, so you have this very nice ERP system. So how do you do your scheduling of jobs? And think of it as a custom job shop. How do you do scheduling? And they said, yeah, we have this ERP system, yes, and they apparently have a scheduling module. But right now, there is this one employee who has worked for the last 40 years who does all the scheduling, right? And this employee is about to retire. And think about, and when I ask the question, why don't you use the system? Well, all these processing times in the ERP system are wrong, right?
Right.
And so when let's say orders come in and it's a job shop environment, every order is custom. Somebody needs to look at them and say, okay, I need to route them differently, and so there's a different routing for each one of them to the production facility. And so I mean, this lady just knows that these things get slower versus faster, or based on years and years of experience. And so she will never trust the data on the ERP system. She'll come up with a schedule by herself, and that's the schedule, right? So now when this person retires, they basically have lost the ability to schedule anything, right? So so that's something that's definitely going to be like a very interesting problem, which is, all of this context that's out there in the ether, right? Which we need to capture, or it's in people's heads, and we need to be able to capture that in some digitized form, so that you can. But the good news is, in the past generations, this would have required, okay, I need to, if I want to capture this data, I need to say, okay, tell me exactly what happens, come up with a database schema where I can actually put all of this stuff in. We don't need to do that anymore. I can just, record this person talking, and maybe depending on the amount of details, the details they're willing to provide, you can capture that information and slowly sort of convert that into more structured form using the tools we have today. And that's wonderful. I think that gives us the sort of the entry point into actually tackling this problem.
So let me follow. Let me go back to you talked about the misalignment between procurement and legal. I thought that was a good example. And in the back of my head, I was thinking, another way to say misalignment is sort of checks and balances too. Like at some level, the leader of an organization wants each of those voices. And I think what you're suggesting too is that if we know the context of these two people, and we now have access to these because you mentioned like documents that aren't being read. Like I have all these other contracts which all had exceptions, and you could almost bring this, instead of the conversation being an argument, it could almost be like you ask the LLM, like, give me the pros and cons of relaxing some of the legal constrictions on this particular contract. Like, what other contracts is this like or not like, and is this an outlier? Because I'm thinking myself on the procurement side, I'm always like, oh, this one's an exception, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not. Maybe this is a total outlier, and I should the legal person to say, no, Mike, you're wrong, or maybe the legal person's wrong, and like, yeah, there's all this good exception stuff, and
so that's exactly how the coordination the AI would do the coordination, right? So there are two dimensions then to every document, which is, I know as a procurement person that there are some metrics that I look for, but then there's a second dimension, which is much more of the legal aspect of this, and I may not know all of it, but the AI that orchestrates this process says, okay, here's all these historical ways in which we address this issue. Like we contracts of this type were typically not approved because there was a certain element of risk involved in it. And you kind of, even while giving the answer to the procurement person, you say, before you submit to the legal person, you may want to consider this, instead of having like
right,
starting from scratch, right? Consider that the legal person is going to come back with these issues. And this is based not just on sort of like, that particular individual. We are talking about what the history of the organization is, which means looking at those documents from the past, and sort of being able to infer the reasoning pathways, right, on those contracts, and being able to sort of bring that into the mix right at the beginning. So that cuts down on it, right? So now I'm not, going into a meeting with this legal person, and I'm really surprised, because the first time I'm hearing all these legal issues, because these are already flagged. I mean, right? So yeah.
That's awesome. It's kind of redesigning the organization. It not necessarily in a fundamental way, but just in this subtle way that actually plays a huge role in sort of how the how
it's an interesting point you bring about redesigning the organization. And one of the things that people reading the book always ask us, right? So, which is, are you advocating for just like we did in the business process reengineering days? Are you advocating for like a shift in organizational structure to be able to accommodate AI? One of the main themes in our book was that we really think, if you go back all the way to like the Herb Simon view of the world, right, which is that organizational structure is actually an effect of cognitive constraints, right? So it's and not the other way around, right? So which is the reason we have the structure we have today is because there are, that information is best processed in the way, that we have the structure, and because of the information systems we have. And so what we advocate is, not this wholesale change of processes. What we argue is, and I see that happening, is there is, once you break down what we call business information reengineering, and that's an entire chapter in the book, is that if once we begin to understand how information flows and start removing bottlenecks in information flow, organization structure will actually evolve to kind of to accommodate that. And you know, we might look at new kinds of team structures simply because information flows because of AI, in much more in a free manner, right? Um, that is not to say that we will not need some change management. I think the change management I'm talking about, if anything, is much more about getting people used to the AI tools. I think I find in practice is the bigger challenge right now. Um, I'm not as much worried about structure. I think structure will evolve once information starts flowing in the right ways. I think structure will evolve to meet that. And so the good news is that this doesn't need wholesale organizational redesign. We believe that organizations will evolve their structure to kind of meet that. But we do need some change management in terms of getting people to get comfortable using these tools. I think which is I think I find today is sort of the bigger challenge to overcome an enterprise.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I really am struck, Ron, by the kind of thesis that you've put forward around organizations are sort of evolve as a consequence of constraints in information flow. Because we saw this kind of in the 80s and 90s as digital technology started to infiltrate large organizations. We had kind of whole layers of people who were simply in the information handoff business. I wouldn't say information enrichment, just information handoff business. And, um, those roles have disappeared, even though those processes and those information sources are still moving.
Yeah.
Um, and I think with Gen AI, the piece of the puzzle that I want to go into now is the agentic piece.
Mhm.
Now, when the information is moving and perhaps not even touching human beings, kind of how does contextual AI play there? Because I think in my sense, is even more important in an environment like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Um, Let me tie this also into this notion that so one thing is, of course, that agents can take over that information transfer role very effectively, right? Um, and so, yeah, if I were to forecast a role where your entire job is just to move information around, that's going to disappear completely. And what I encourage people to think about is, even in their own job profiles, you need to think about which parts of this are just moving information versus actually making some judgment calls. The judgment calls are going to remain. I think the movement of information is going to be taken over completely by agents at this point, because I don't need I can you can it's easy enough to put together an agent that can take the data, move the data, and transform the data in some ways, clean up the data, create certain buckets of information, and then
But
move those buckets in different directions depending on where they need to be moved, right?
yeah, and I
That
think
is, yeah,
the thing you
yeah,
mentioned earlier that I was struck by, the documents that nobody reads, right? Because we don't read them because we had too much on our plate, but the agents
can read
cheerfully
them. Yeah,
read them, memorize them,
yeah,
and
yeah,
share them,
yeah.
share them and utilize them as they see fit. So that's a kind of a really clear connection, right? Which is Yogi Berra famously said about the restaurant in New Jersey, the place is so crowded, nobody goes there. We've got so many documents, so many information sources. I feel like a lot of our knowledge workers now are sort of spend their time as data detectives.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Although one of the things I do, and this wasn't in the book. We kind of were beginning to get there, but I think we sort of fleshed this out much more in this article in the IMD review, and these are my book authors, and as well as another person from IMD as well. And this is an article from July of last year where we talk about agentic chaos. One of the challenges I see is that, yes, I agree with your point, Vijay, that there's all these documents that no one's reading, so the agents can actually go read them. What we also don't want is that we don't want to get into this, what in the consumer sense is called AI slop, right? What we want to avoid is this sort of chaos that this might create, where there are like 10 different agents producing 15 different 100 different things, and then the bottleneck in some ways has shifted from the reading of the documents to understanding what the agents are talking about, because there are just too many things going on. And one of the things that I I really, really advocate is this idea of, and my advocacy, in addition to sort of, of course, when you work with a company, you talk about these issues, but then at a broader level, my advocacy is there needs to be agentic governance. If you don't put in place some kind of agentic governance, then what we are simply doing is, it's like, people used to talk about JIT, right? Good JIT implementations reduce inventory throughout the entire supply chain, but bad JIT implementations simply move the inventory from one part of the supply chain to another. That's the kind of problem that we want to avoid. And I always, yeah, but I agree with you. It's like agents have this great opportunity, but we also have to be very careful about managing them, because there is, of course, the chaos in terms of information that can be produced. There are, of course, security issues. And by the way, this agentic chaos we talked about, at the time when we talked about this in July in this article, you know, most people were like, this just seems like science fiction. And then today it's you talk about mold book and built on OpenClaw, and you see the all everything that's emerging. You realize that this is a genuine possibility, and there are more issues than just sort of just the data confusion. There's security issues, safety issues, all of that. Yeah.
So I like also, I think the governance, you talk about security and safety, but that's like what everyone talks about. But you mentioned something else about governance I thought was really interesting. Like Ethan Malik has this thing too, where the agents are like really great. He's like, what are you going to do? Are you going to just generate thousands of more PowerPoints and thousands more dashboards? Like, that's not the answer. And I think you're suggesting like we need a governance layer there that prioritizes some of that stuff, so we don't have the agents just overwhelming the organization with this information
Yeah,
we have
absolutely.
too
In
much
fact,
of. That's
a
interesting.
different, and in fact, I'll give you a practical example of this. A different manufacturing company, also on the East Coast, that I've been talking to. I mean, they they went after this process of like allowing people to create agents using, let's say, a Microsoft Copilot Studio, for example, and they discovered this sort of agentic chaos pretty soon. And they said, okay, at some point, the CIO had to make, an executive decision saying that no more agents. Every time you now create an agent, you need to get it approved through my office before you kind of, you post it or register it on
Okay.
the MCP server.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be, we're not able to keep track of what's actually happening. So, it's like there are too many agents and we don't know what is, this, which of these are overlapping, so there is this, general chaos that's happening. And this is a real problem companies are beginning to face now. I mean, I find it's this very bimodality in terms of implementation. Is on the one hand, you have companies which are like, okay, how do I move from ChatGPT to something that's more contextual to my company, which is the core problem that we have been talking about from the beginning of this. But there is also the other end of the spectrum where the more progressive companies are moved further ahead, but then they're facing these other challenges of execution, because of issues like governance.
Well, that's near and dear to the kind of hearts of our listeners who are thinking about decision making and
Yeah.
decision making at scale. Um, I'm interested in how you would distinguish contextual AI from traditional business rules and workflows. And I think just it feels like an elementary question, but one that might be helpful to our audience who's very used to kind of business rules and automation workflows.
And business rules and automation workflows were very useful, but I often found that there was um, two kinds of problems. One is democratizing them across different groups would get pretty difficult, because often there was, in the way we interacted with these tools, there was a significant amount of hard coding in terms of the user experience, uh, there'll be a very specific kind of dashboard with these specific parameters, and then you get to play around only with that. And if I have something that's a little bit off, then there's no way I can actually test that out. For example, I can't, I understand it. I understand it because there is, I'm in the supply chain space, but then if I give it to, let's say, a marketing person, they have no idea how to use this, to make sense of, like, to at least get a feeling for what the solutions that might provide. So there was this inability to sort of like democratize that to the extent we want to democratize it. I mean, not everything should be visible to everyone, but at the same time, even in genuine use cases where you wanted some amount of cross-functional visibility into these things, it got pretty difficult, right? For example, if we take a software like Anaplan traditionally, which is great for supply chains in many sectors, I've heard this very bimodal opinion. People who actually work with Anaplan on a day-to-day basis, they love it. But people who kind of use it sort of more, not maybe on a daily basis, but want to understand how it works so that they can make some decisions in their own space, they hate it. So it's like, there's this bimodality because so that's a classic example of traditional software where you are not able to like bridge, you're not able to really sort of, it gets very hard-coded, right? Then there's the temporal issue. Over time, as sort of like things change in the environment, things change in your internal processes, right? The software doesn't change. And every time you need to make changes, it's a new feature request. Someone's going to go in, figure out exactly what needs to change, and there is all of that, right? So there were these tremendous bottlenecks in terms of democratizing the product, across the organization, as well as keeping it fresh and usable across time. And I think that's the problem. I think is going to go away. It's going to bring in some new things, challenges, as I've talked about governance and all of that. But I think the agentic architectures will allow us to interact with these systems in a way that we have never been able to do before. So, which means that I may not know much about a lot of the details of how, let's say, a supply chain network is being optimized. But I just want to answer the question. I just want to put together a scenario. What if we decided to source from here? And I don't have to give necessarily like too many details because I don't have all these hard-coded details available. But can I run a scenario which I can just articulate in words and go from just that business use case and using the context, go to run some models, get an answer back, and give you a report, right? And so I think that is definitely feasible. It does come with some challenges, which is you need to have the right guardrails. I mean, not everybody should be able to access everything. It does come with this sort of issue of chaos. So yes, but I think what's the gap between traditional systems and now, and where we're headed? I think that's exactly it. Which is it just makes the movement of it just does makes decision making a lot more fluid, because when I have to make a decision, I don't have to talk to 4 different people and put together an entire an entire project to actually answer that. I can just ask a question and get some at least 3 quick scenarios within an hour at least.
I think what you brought this up in your blog post today. So today is March 11th. I'm not sure when this will release, but you brought this up in a blog post where you're talking about sales, planning sales territories for pharmaceutical reps.
Yes. Yeah.
And you talked about how in the past it was like 3 or 4 weeks to run a scenario, and now it's you can do it much quicker. What you sort of proved it can be much quicker with agents. Like, could you explain a little bit, like, what did the agents do that actually sped up that process? Like, because there must be optimization models that's behind there. There must be business rules for how you're allowed to sign this. Like, what did the agents do that allowed you to speed this up?
Right. So often what would happen, so 20 years back, I understand this problem very well because my first job after my PhD was in this space. So I was in New Jersey doing the Salesforce optimization for pharmaceutical companies all around Route 22 for a consulting company, which it doesn't exist in its current form in its original form anymore. But essentially, we did a fair amount of work with the top pharmaceutical firms in that area. And what I always found interesting was the fact that we had some pretty good models. So, for example, very good optimizers, very good forecasting models. What would add time to the project was we kind of knew what models worked, and we had good heuristics, if there are difficult problems like the traveling salesman, and so we had all of that. What really kind of we found challenging was that the inputs to these models, would keep changing, and they would change because we were in a consulting environment. The client would say, okay, hey, we think there's going to be this new competitive launch. Because this is new competitive launch, we are going to have to adjust some of these numbers up and down. And then we were constantly in this treadmill of, every few days something would change scenario. Someone in the client organization would come up and say there would be there is this, and then we had to okay, how does this even begin to affect our models, right? I mean, so we had to go from this very nebulous market description, right, to actually drilling it down to the exact parameters in the model. And that is where we spend a lot of time on. Like, it's like the models themselves, yeah, sure. Once we knew this model works, The question is, once you kind of move all of that to the to the model, then it all works, right?
Right.
And so it would frustrate me because often we were dealing with all this different threads of information, and yeah, I mean, you get paid for that. At the same time, I was always thinking, is there a way to do this better? I mean, right?
Right.
And for the longest time, I don't think we had the ability to do it better simply because we didn't have this
Right.
ability to parse. So, for example, I can build we built an agent that basically says, yeah, when someone goes in and tries to ask this kind of a question, these are all the things that we need to check for, and these are the guidelines you need to use to be able to and this is where you need to pull information from. This is how we
Right.
verify whether the information is correct or not. So, which effectively means that a process that might have taken me like several weeks to run one scenario, because most of the time I'm spending trying to just collect the different forms of data and trying to see whether they match the assumptions the client wants to put in place.
Right.
We can
Yeah,
just cut the time down. So, and then the second part of it is, of course, the people ask me, what about the modeling stuff itself? How will the agents handle that? That actually is surprisingly, there is a handoff, right? So you say, okay, once you model the problem, you can actually call a deterministic. Now we are moved from the stochastic sort of view of the world where there's uncertainty and you're trying to characterize that uncertainty. Now we kind of do a handoff to, let's say, a subroutine, an agent which contains a subroutine, which has the model in place. And so it passes all the parameters to the model and it executes that model as you would traditionally do and gives you back an answer. And remember, that answer now can actually be put back into a report, and you can construct a report which is, the amount of time you would spend on duplicating and adjusting PowerPoint decks. I mean, that's completely gone away, right? So that entire cycle now is going to move a lot faster.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this discussion connects with some of our previous guests in a really interesting way. This last part, of course, Mike, I think of Harley Davis and the idea of kind of using Gen AI to much more quickly formulate our business rules and our optimization problems. But I also think of Warren Powell and Adam DeJans and Warren's kind of whole notion around sequential decision making that's state-based policies. That what Ram is talking about is, oh my God, what a nightmare it had been to characterize the new state information historically,
Exactly.
right? And
That's
our ability to update that now is
Yeah.
almost magical.
Yeah. Spoken like a true OR person, Vijay. So I think, I completely, I would not use that in a layperson audience, but I exactly get what you're saying. It's about characterizing the state of the world at that point in time, right? Because that used to be the most challenging problem. I mean, I think it's not. We have a heuristic in place which kind of is going to give you to some degree of optimality.
Right. Given the inputs, it's going to do its job. But here, I think there's two things at play: both the state of the world and our managerial assumptions that we're feeding in. And you're saying, and I remember this so well from consulting. Well, what if we decided to go this way instead?
Mhm.
Right. And then, okay, what does that mean? How does that translate to the inputs and the structures? That was hard work.
Yeah.
And we did get paid, but I always felt like that was every step we took down a path like that was a step closer to fee fatigue from our clients.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Both of you have kind of talked about this fact that you're getting paid for this work as a consultant, but even then, it felt wrong. It felt like you'd rather be doing more highly value added things. And I think this is kind of a message I think that's kind of positive in the whole LLM. Like most of the people talk about LLMs. Oh, I hate all this automation. It takes away our jobs. It's like, probably might take away things that you don't really like in the first place.
So
That sort of annoy you anyway.
Your point, Michael. So let's actually parse what's the value add here, right? So we're talking about, let's say, building an agent that can characterize the state of the world dynamically, right? So that the downstream models can actually execute well. What's the value add of our human value add here? I really think that giving the agent the right context upfront is actually the biggest value add, which is that the real challenge for us was, okay, it's not like I didn't know the context. It was kind of I know sort of the context because I have this experience doing this, solving this problem, but then I'm trying to get this input from, let's say, the client, and I'm trying to match this with sort of my contextual understanding, and then coming up with these assumptions and rules and all of that. but I still can do the same thing, except that now the agent has those things. So which means that, if I can write up, here are the things you need to look for. Here are the things you need to kind of, think about when you're looking at these new assumptions that the client is putting forth. There's value in that. And, I think the differentiation will come from, it will come from, what kind of context. Like two different consultants might actually think about this problem very differently, and they might then imbue the agent with that context, right? And so the agent then goes in and says, okay, now I can, I'm looking at it from a certain perspective, and there's a different perspective, and that's how it works. What you've really cut out is I still think that um, there's going to be this very, very tacit human context that's somewhat differentiated and difficult to sort of like, for the LLM or any other AI model to be able to understand right off the bat. But the LLM, once you give it that context, it knows, okay, now I know all I need to do is, put all these two and two together and give you the final answer. So, and that's the part I don't want to do.
It almost feels like the context that I'm providing at some point, it seems so subtle, but the subtlety is the fact that I'm the one that gets fired, or I'm the one that's in trouble if this is wrong. And so just that incentive alone, just passing that incentive to the LLM is like enough. Like that's the value. Like someone has to be responsible, and then that's what you deliver. That's the value add you provide.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's actually my kind of, one of my mantras about agentic systems for decision making is, they're going to enable us to do things faster and hopefully better, but there's still a human accountable. And that human is going to have to get the same trust with the agentic solution as they are with any other technological solution. It'll help if they understand and believe that the context is being interpreted correctly, because that's one of the things we hear over and over again, why they're not using the tool because, well, it's like your upstate New York manufacturing example. They don't know. The tool doesn't have the right data, doesn't have the right context. I don't trust it. End of story.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, you can think of these agents as, so if I'm giving this agent some context and deploying this agent for someone else's my customer's purpose, right? These agents are de facto my employees. And just like in the traditional organization, if my direct report, causes a problem, I'm going to be held responsible for it also, right? And the same thing is going to happen here, which is if the agent doesn't work well, I was the one who told it what to do. I was the one who sort of like, mentored the agent almost to kind of do work in a certain way. And so it's my responsibility to ensure that it kind of, so this idea of human agency is not going to go away. The autonomous part is really about, ultimately we live in a human world and we have to interact with other people. And so we are responsible to each other. I think really we are moving towards where a lot of the, just moving information around, synthesizing stuff, which I think is really still is going to be automated by some of these agents, but we still have to provide it the necessary context, and context is really what we control. Yeah.
So I'd like to offer up a final comment and ask you guys, both of you, to respond to it as we wrap up. And that is, okay, I fundamentally believe contextual AI can help us make the same decisions more quickly, as we've talked about, by gathering the context. I'm interested in how contextual AI will help us not only make faster decisions, but better ones, and what you guys think about that as my last question.
So my view on this is, because you can speed things up, you can examine many more options, and the quality of solutions will improve because we have a greater diversity of options to actually consider. And in fact, I'm very much a believer in this idea of what I read in this Harvard HBR article, that AI is actually making our work more intense, which, there are some negatives to that. But it's like I'm able to examine 10 more options, which I could not before. And I'm pretty sure this exploration of options is going to lead to a better option somewhere, which I can. So quality is going to improve because of that more exploration.
Yeah, I like that. It's also I would go like, people say like when like in the optimization world, when solvers got faster, like, we'll be able to solve these problems faster. But what happened was people solved actually harder problems. And I suspect something similar might happen here, is that the decisions we make today, we can make the same ones faster, but maybe we can just make better decisions because we can now make sort of harder decisions and consider more factors. It still might take us the same amount of time, but it's a harder, bigger, more important decision that we're making.
That's, in fact, Michael, that's already happening. If you look at all the stuff that they're doing, theorem proving they're doing in math, where you're solving unsolved problems and so on. It's
Right.
and I'm personally involved in some aspects of analog circuits, an area which I didn't know at all, but turns out optimization is useful in that context. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, Ram, you want to wrap it up? I'll let people know where they can find more information about you, the book, your company, which we didn't get to talk about. Just if you can give a little plug for all that.
Yeah, sure. My book of The Ascended Enterprise is available on Amazon. That's probably the best place to get it. And of course, I think the publisher Taylor & Francis also has their own link as well. And my company Samvid is growing rapidly in multiple directions. One of the directions where I think which has been very interesting is actually my own world of academia, where we're deploying it as an autonomous TA, autonomous RA. And the RA part is actually very interesting because that has a direct connection to this idea that you can deploy these autonomous agents for consulting, for instance, right? So there's a lot of carry. It's like if I can solve a business case in my classroom using these
Right.
agents, it's all just a matter of just scaling that up to like an enterprise use case, and that's kind of the direction we're headed.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah,
Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
And we will see you all next time on our next episode of the Decision Intelligence Lab. Don't forget to subscribe at decisionintelligencelab.substack.com. If you like the episode, tell your friends. If you didn't like the episode, just don't tell anybody.